December 17th, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness hung over the Belgian village of Foy like a death shroud as First Lieutenant Richard Winters stood at the window of a commandeered farmhouse, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the temperature had already dropped to -5 degrees Fahrenheit, and his men, Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, were digging foxholes in ground so frozen it rang like iron when struck with entrenching tools. They had arrived in Bastogne less than 24 hours earlier, still wearing the same combat uniforms they'd fought in during Operation Market Garden 2 months before. No winter coats, no thermal underwear, no gloves beyond the thin wool issue that offered little protection against the bitter cold now settling over the Ardennes forest. The supply situation was catastrophic, but what troubled Winters more was the intelligence reports coming from division headquarters. German forces were everywhere, moving fast, and Easy Company stood directly in their path. Adolf Hitler's surprise offensive, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, had shattered the American lines with brutal efficiency. 3 entire German armies, over 400,000 men, supported by more than 1,000 tanks, had punched through the thinly held positions in the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge in Allied lines that would give the battle its name. The objective was audacious in its scope: drive to Antwerp, split the Allied forces, capture the vital supply port, and force Britain and America to negotiate a separate peace. At the center of this maelstrom sat Bastogne, an unremarkable Belgian market town of barely 4,000 souls that possessed one quality, making it invaluable to both sides. 7 major roads converged here, making it the crucial transportation hub for any military movement through the southern Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the ability to move armies, supplies, and reinforcements across the entire region. Easy Company had been resting in Mourmelon, France, recovering from the hell of Market Garden when the orders came. The 101st Airborne Division was to move immediately to Bastogne and hold it against all comers. There was no time for proper preparation, no opportunity to draw winter equipment, barely enough time to load onto the trucks that would carry them into what veterans would later describe as the coldest, most brutal fighting of the entire war. Winters moved through his company's positions as first light broke across the frozen landscape. His men were spread along a defensive line northeast of Bastogne, occupying positions hastily prepared by units that had retreated through the area just hours before. Sergeant Don Malarkey looked up from the foxhole he was deepening with a bayonet, the ground too hard for his entrenching tool to penetrate. "Sir, the boys are asking about winter gear," Malarkey said, his lips already showing the blue tinge of early frostbite. "Some of them are wearing summer issue still. We're going to start losing men to the cold before the Germans even get here." Winters nodded grimly. "Supplies working on it. Until then, tell the men to scavenge whatever they can from abandoned positions, blankets, coats, anything, and make sure they're rotating in and out of the warming fires every 30 minutes. Frostbite casualties are just as useless as combat casualties." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The sound that had haunted American soldiers since Normandy reached them around 0900 hours, the distinctive grinding whine of German tank engines, still distant but growing steadily louder. Winters grabbed his field glasses and scanned the tree line to the northeast. Through the morning mist, he could make out movement. Lots of movement. Infantry in field grey, advancing in open formation, supported by armor whose silhouettes suggested Panthers or Mark IVs. Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere appeared at Winters' elbow, his Thompson submachine gun cradled across his chest. "How many you figure, Lieutenant?" "More than us," Winters replied. "Get the bazooka teams forward. I want them positioned with good fields of fire on those approach roads. And tell Lipton to make sure every man has at least 2 bandoliers of ammunition. We're going to need it." The German probe hit Easy Company's positions at 10:30 that morning. It wasn't a full assault, merely a reconnaissance in force designed to test American strength and locate defensive positions. But even this probing attack demonstrated the overwhelming force the Germans could bring to bear. Artillery shells screamed overhead, detonating among the scattered farmhouses and hedgerows where Easy Company had established its thin line. Private First Class George Luce, the company's radio man, crouched in a foxhole that offered minimal protection, trying to maintain contact with battalion headquarters while German shells walked closer to his position. The radio crackled with overlapping transmissions as other companies around Bastogne's perimeter reported similar probing attacks. The pattern was clear. The Germans were testing the entire defensive ring, looking for weak points to exploit. The temperature continued dropping throughout the day. By 1400 hours, it had reached -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and men were beginning to show serious effects of cold weather exposure. Corporal Walter Gordon discovered Private Eugene Jackson unconscious in his foxhole, hypothermia having robbed him of the ability to stay alert. Gordon dragged Jackson to one of the warming fires, but the medic, Eugene Rowe, shook his head grimly. "He's got frostbite on both feet and 3 fingers, Rowe reported to Winters. "Needs evacuation to a field hospital, but there's no way to get him out. We're surrounded." The word hung in the cold air like an accusation. Surrounded. By nightfall, on December 17th, German forces had completed their encirclement of Bastogne. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, along with the rest of the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units, were cut off from all ground contact with other Allied forces. Supply lines had been severed. Reinforcements could not reach them. Medical evacuation was impossible. Easy Company settled into the bitter night, knowing they were truly alone, facing an enemy that outnumbered them significantly and possessed overwhelming advantages in armor and artillery. Winters organized the night watch rotation personally, ensuring that despite the brutal cold, sufficient men remained alert to sound the alarm if German forces attempted a night attack. The men who weren't on watch huddled in their inadequate foxholes, sharing body heat when possible, burning anything combustible to create small warming fires that offered brief respite from the killing cold. Sergeant Denver Randleman, a massive man whose physical strength had made him legendary within Easy Company, had found an old Belgian blanket in an abandoned farmhouse. He shared it with 3 other men. The 4 of them pressed together in a foxhole designed for 2, their combined body heat the only thing standing between them and hypothermia. "How long you figure we can hold out like this, Bull?" asked Private Alex Pencala, his teeth chattering despite being pressed against Randleman's side. "Long as we have to," Randleman replied, his voice carrying a certainty he might not have felt. "We're the 101st. We don't run, and we don't quit." December 18th brought no improvement in either temperature or tactical situation. If anything, both deteriorated. The mercury plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and German forces began systematic artillery bombardment of Bastogne and its surrounding defensive positions. Easy Company's sector came under heavy fire throughout the morning, shells bursting among their positions with methodical precision that suggested German observers had thoroughly mapped American defensive locations. The shelling inflicted casualties that Easy Company could ill afford. Private First Class Warren Muck was killed instantly when a shell detonated directly in his foxhole. Private Skip Muck, no relation but close friend, was wounded by the same explosion, shrapnel lacerating his left leg and shoulder. Medic Eugene Rowe worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, despite having already exhausted half his medical supplies. "I need more morphine," Rowe told Winters during a brief lull in the bombardment. "And bandages, and plasma. Sir, I'm running out of everything. If we take many more casualties, I won't be able to treat them." Winters had no answer that would help. Supply drops had been attempted, but failed due to weather conditions that kept Allied aircraft grounded. The garrison of Bastogne was being forced to make do with whatever they'd brought with them, and for Easy Company, that meant ammunition was being carefully rationed and medical supplies were running critically low. The cold was proving as deadly as German artillery. By mid-afternoon on the 18th, Easy Company had logged 15 cold weather casualties, ranging from mild frostbite to full hypothermia, requiring immediate treatment. Men were rotating through warming positions more frequently now, but the warming fires themselves were becoming harder to maintain as fuel supplies dwindled. Lieutenant Harry Welsh, commanding 2nd Platoon, reported to Winters that several of his men were showing signs of trench foot, their boots having frozen to their feet during the night. "We need to get them dry socks and boots, Dick," Welsh said, "but we don't have any. Some of these boys have been wearing the same wet socks for 3 days." "Do what you can," Winters replied, though both men knew that phrase was becoming meaningless. They were already doing everything possible. And it wasn't enough. German forces probed Easy Company's positions again that evening, this time with more determination. Infantry, supported by a single panzer tank, advanced toward the company's left flank, testing whether the paratroopers could stop armored vehicles with nothing but small arms and a handful of bazooka rounds. Staff Sergeant William Guarner organized the defense, positioning his best bazooka team, Privates Joseph Toy and George Lewes, in a concealed position with clear line of sight to the approaching armor. The panzer rumbled forward cautiously, its commander apparently aware that American positions lay ahead but uncertain of their exact locations. When it reached a range of approximately 75 yards, Toy rose from his position and fired. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the panzer's front glacis plate and detonated, but the armor held. The tank's machine gun swiveled toward the source of the attack, sending a stream of bullets that forced Toy to dive for cover. Lutz, positioned 30 yards to Toy's right, fired a second bazooka round that struck the panzer's more vulnerable side armor. This time, the result was catastrophic. The shaped charge penetrated the tank's hull, detonating ammunition stored inside. The panzer's turret blew off in a spectacular explosion, and the supporting German infantry fell back in disorder. Easy Company had held, but at cost. The bazooka engagement had expended 2 of their precious anti-tank rounds, and they possessed fewer than a dozen remaining. When German armor came again, and everyone knew it would, they might not have the means to stop it. Night fell on December 18th, with Easy Company still holding its sector of the Bastogne perimeter, but the strain was beginning to show. Men were exhausted from constant vigilance, weakened by inadequate food rations, and suffering increasing effects of cold weather exposure. Winters walked his lines after dark, speaking quietly with soldiers in their foxholes, offering what encouragement he could, while privately wondering how long they could sustain this defense. He found Private David Webster huddled in a foxhole with Corporal Joseph Liebgott, the 2 men sharing a single wool blanket and taking turns sleeping in 20-minute shifts. Webster looked up as Winters approached, his face gaunt in the dim light of a carefully shielded candle. "Sir, we heard the Germans are offering terms," Webster said. "Honorable surrender, they're calling it. Any truth to that?" Winters had heard the same rumor. German psychological warfare units had been broadcasting surrender demands in English, promising humane treatment for prisoners and warning of annihilation if the Americans refused to yield. The broadcasts were designed to erode morale, to plant seeds of doubt about whether continued resistance made sense. "General McAuliffe's answer to that offer is not suitable for me to repeat," Winters said with a slight smile, "but the short version is we're not surrendering. We're holding Bastogne, and we're holding it until relieved. You boys just keep your positions and keep your weapons clean. Help is coming." Webster nodded, though the doubt in his eyes suggested he wondered whether help would arrive in time. Winters moved on to the next position, repeating the same message of determination and confidence, while around him the temperature continued its relentless descent toward -20°F. December 19th brought a development that offered both hope and frustration in equal measure. The weather cleared slightly, allowing Allied aircraft to attempt supply drops. Easy Company, like every other unit in the Bastogne perimeter, looked skyward at 0900 hours as the distinctive drone of C-47 transport engines echoed across the frozen landscape. High above the besieged town formations of transport aircraft appeared, their fighter escorts weaving protective patterns around them. The sight brought cheers from men who had begun to feel abandoned by their own army. Parachutes blossomed against the winter sky, red and yellow and white canopies drifting earthward, carrying desperately needed supplies. But the wind that morning was strong and unpredictable, and many supply bundles drifted beyond the American perimeter into German-controlled territory. Winters organized an immediate recovery operation, sending Sergeant Carwood Lipton with a patrol to retrieve bundles that had landed in no man's land between American and German positions. Lipton led his men in a cautious advance through knee-deep snow, retrieving 3 bundles before German machine gun fire forced them to withdraw. The recovered supplies proved disappointing. One bundle contained K rations, which were welcome but insufficient for the company's needs. Another held medical supplies, which went immediately to Eugene Rowe's rapidly depleting aid station. The third bundle contained winter gear, gloves and wool caps, and thermal underwear, but only enough for perhaps 20 men out of Easy Company's complement of over 100. "It's better than nothing," Lipton reported to Winters as they sorted through the recovered supplies. "But, sir, we need about 10 times this much just to get everyone properly equipped, and that's before we even talk about ammunition." The ammunition situation was becoming critical. Easy Company had burned through roughly 40% of its rifle ammunition during the probing attacks of the previous 2 days. Machine gun ammunition was down to about a third of normal combat load, and those precious bazooka rounds, the only weapons capable of stopping German armor, were down to 8 remaining rockets. Winters called his platoon leaders together in the basement of the farmhouse that served as company headquarters. Harry Welsh, Buck Compton, and Carwood Lipton gathered around a map spread across a wooden crate, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. "We're going to have to start rationing ammunition more strictly," Winters told them. "I want marksmen only engaging targets, no suppressive fire unless absolutely necessary. Machine gun teams fire in short bursts, not sustained, and the bazooka teams hold fire unless they're engaging armor. No using rockets on infantry positions, no matter how tempting." Buck Compton, whose normal good humor had been worn away by 3 days of brutal combat and brutal cold, shook his head. "Dick, the men are already conserving everything. They're down to eating half rations. They're burning furniture to stay warm. We're holding together with spit and determination, but there's a limit to how much longer we can sustain this." "I know," Winters replied quietly, "but until Patton breaks through from the south, we don't have a choice. We hold here, or we die here. Those are the only options the Germans have left us." The afternoon of December 19th brought renewed German pressure on Easy Company's sector. This time, the attack was more sophisticated, combining artillery preparation with coordinated infantry assault supported by multiple armored vehicles. The bombardment began at 1400 hours, shells falling with such intensity that men pressed themselves into the frozen earth of their foxholes, praying that cold, stiffened ground would provide sufficient protection. Private First Class Robert Wynne was not fortunate. A shell detonated directly above his position, the blast killing him instantly and wounding the 2 men sharing his foxhole. Sergeant Floyd Talbot led a rescue team under continuing fire, pulling the wounded men to relative safety and calling for medics, but there was nothing anyone could do for Wynne. When the artillery barrage lifted, German infantry appeared at the tree line 500 yards from Easy. Companies, forward positions. They advanced in textbook formation, squads providing covering fire while others moved forward, working their way across open ground toward the American lines. Behind them, 3 German tanks, likely Mark IVs from their silhouettes, rumbled forward, providing mobile fire support. Winters gave the order to open fire only when German infantry reached 300 yards, wanting to ensure that every shot counted. The distinctive crack of M1 Garand rifles erupted along Easy Company's line, and German soldiers began falling. But they kept coming, closing the distance through sheer determination and numerical advantage. The German tanks proved more problematic. Their 75mm main guns outranged anything Easy Company possessed except the bazooka teams, and those teams couldn't engage until the tanks came much closer. Winters watched through field glasses as one tank began systematically engaging American positions, its high explosive shells demolishing foxholes and turning the frozen earth into a killing ground. "Get Toy's bazooka team forward," Winters ordered. "If that tank gets much closer, it's going to roll right through our line." Staff Sergeant Joe Toy, already moving before the order reached him, sprinted from his position to a small fold in the ground that offered concealment and a good angle on the approaching armor. Private Alex Pencala followed with spare bazooka rounds. The two men set up quickly, Toy bracing the launcher on his shoulder while Pencala loaded the rocket. The range was long for a bazooka shot, nearly 200 yards, but waiting for the tank to close further would allow it to spot their position and engage them with its machine guns. Toy aimed carefully, leading the moving target slightly, and fired. The rocket streaked across the frozen field, trailing white smoke, and struck the tank's turret. The explosion damaged the tank's main gun, but didn't penetrate the armor. The tank commander, realizing he was under anti-tank fire, traversed his turret, seeking the source of the attack. Toy and Pencala were already moving, scrambling to a new position before the tank's machine gun could find them. Pencala loaded a second round, and Toy fired again. This shot struck the tank's track assembly, throwing the track and immobilizing the vehicle. Unable to maneuver and under increasingly accurate rifle fire from Easy Company, the tank crew abandoned their vehicle and withdrew with the retreating German infantry. The attack had been repulsed, but Easy Company was now down to 6 bazooka rounds, and the day wasn't over. German forces probed the defenses again at dusk, testing different sectors of the line, seeking weak points they could exploit. Each probe was beaten back, but each cost Easy Company ammunition and casualties they could not afford to lose. By nightfall on December 19th, the company's effective strength had fallen to roughly 80 men fit for duty. Cold, weather casualties, combat casualties, and simple exhaustion had reduced Easy Company to barely half its normal fighting strength. Winters reorganized his remaining men, consolidating positions and shortening the line to maintain adequate density of firepower. The temperature that night reached -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest reading yet. Men who had been functioning despite frostbite and exposure now began to break down. Private First Class Eugene Jackson, who had been evacuated with hypothermia 2 days earlier, died in the aid station. Despite Eugene Rowe's best efforts, Jackson had never regained consciousness, his body simply unable to generate enough warmth to sustain life. Sergeant Don Malarkey found Jackson's body when he came off watch at midnight. The young soldier had been wrapped in every blanket the aid station possessed, but it hadn't been enough. Malarkey stood looking at Jackson's frozen face for a long moment, then returned to his foxhole without speaking. There was nothing to say that the cold and the dark hadn't already communicated more eloquently than words. December 20th dawned grey and bitter, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Easy Company woke to find several inches of fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering their positions and reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. The snow was tactically useful, making it harder for German observers to pinpoint American positions, but it made the cold even more unbearable. Winters made his morning rounds of the positions, checking on his men and assessing their condition. What he saw troubled him deeply. Faces were gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of men pushed beyond normal limits of endurance. Hands shook from a combination of cold and nervous strain. These were paratroopers, elite soldiers who had survived D-Day and Market Garden, but even elite soldiers had breaking points, and Easy Company was approaching theirs. "Sir, we got a problem," Sergeant Carwood Lipton reported when Winters reached the command post. "Supplies trying another airdrop at 0900, but Division wants us to send a patrol to recover supplies from yesterday's drop that fell in no man's land. Intelligence thinks the Germans haven't recovered those bundles yet." Winters studied the map. The supply bundles in question had landed approximately 400 yards beyond Easy Company's perimeter, in an area that German patrols certainly controlled by now. Sending men into that zone would be extremely dangerous, but the supplies were desperately needed. "Who's available for patrol duty?" "Malarkey's squad is freshest," Lipton replied. "They've been in reserve for the last 12 hours. But, sir, they're not exactly fresh. Nobody's fresh anymore." "Send them anyway, full combat load, and tell Malarkey I want speed over stealth. Get in, grab what they can carry, and get out fast. No heroics." Sergeant Don Malarkey assembled his patrol at 0830 hours. 7 men, including himself, each carrying weapons and empty packs to hold recovered supplies. They moved out through Easy Company's perimeter under covering fire from their comrades, advancing cautiously through the snow toward the location where supplies had been seen falling the previous day. The patrol had covered about 200 yards when German machine gun fire erupted from a farmhouse to their left. Malarkey and his men dove for cover, returning fire while trying to locate the German position. Bullets kicked up snow around them, and Malarkey realized they'd walked into an ambush. The Germans had indeed seen the supply drop and were waiting for Americans to attempt recovery. "Fall back!" Malarkey shouted. "Leapfrog movement, go!" The patrol began a fighting withdrawal, teams providing covering fire while others moved toward American lines. Private First Class George Lewes took a bullet through his left shoulder but kept moving, stumbling through the snow, with blood staining his jacket. Corporal Walter Gordon grabbed Lewes and half-carried him, refusing to leave the wounded radioman behind. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The patrol made it back to American lines, having recovered no supplies, but having identified a new German position that would need to be dealt with. Medic Eugene Rowe treated Lewes' wound, determining that the bullet had passed through tissue without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Lewes would survive, but he was out of action for the foreseeable future, and Easy Company had just lost its primary radioman. The attempted supply drop at 0900 hours fared little better than the patrol. German anti-aircraft fire had intensified, and only about half the planned supply drops made it to the American perimeter. Of those that did land within reach, Easy Company received portions of 2 bundles, one containing ammunition and one containing food rations. The ammunition was welcome, though it replaced only about a quarter of what the company had expended over the past 2 days. The food provided enough for 1 full meal per man, the first adequate meal Easy Company had received since arriving at Bastogne. The afternoon brought a development that changed the psychological dynamic of the siege. Radio operators monitoring German frequencies picked up transmissions indicating that American forces were advancing from the south. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army, having disengaged from its offensive in the Saar region and wheeled 90 degrees north, was fighting its way toward Bastogne. The news spread through Easy Company's positions like wildfire, bringing a resurgence of hope to men who had begun to doubt whether relief would ever arrive. Winters cautioned against excessive optimism, reminding his men that Patton was still miles away and facing the same German forces that surrounded Bastogne. But privately, he felt his own spirits lift. They were no longer fighting without hope of rescue. They merely had to hold out a little longer. German forces, apparently aware that time was running out before American relief forces arrived, increased the intensity of their attacks on December 20th. Easy Company's sector came under assault 3 separate times that afternoon and evening, each attack more desperate than the last. German commanders were throwing everything they had at the Bastogne perimeter, trying to break through before Patton's tanks arrived. The final attack of the day came just after sunset. German infantry, supported by assault guns, advancing through the gathering darkness. The fighting devolved into a close-range brawl. Germans reaching Easy Company's forward foxholes before being driven back by rifle fire and grenades. Private First Class John Julian was killed when a German potato masher grenade landed in his foxhole. Sergeant Denver Randleman killed 3 German soldiers with his Thompson submachine gun at ranges of less than 10 yards. When the attack finally broke and German forces withdrew, Easy Company's forward positions were littered with German dead and several wounded prisoners. The prisoners were brought to the command post, where Winters questioned them through an interpreter. The German soldiers, many of them young and exhausted, told a story that mirrored Easy Company's own situation. Low ammunition, inadequate cold weather gear, insufficient food, and growing doubt about whether their offensive could succeed. "They're as beat up as we are," Winters told his platoon leaders after the interrogation. "Maybe more so. If we can hold one more day, two at most, this whole German offensive is going to collapse." December 21st brought weather that was simultaneously Easy Company's enemy and ally. Heavy snow began falling before dawn, reducing visibility to near zero, but also grounding aircraft on both sides and forcing German forces to suspend major operations. The day passed in relative quiet, punctuated only by occasional artillery exchanges and small patrol actions. Winters used the lull to reorganize his severely depleted company. With only about 70 men still fit for duty, he consolidated his defensive line even further, creating a tighter perimeter that his reduced force could adequately defend. The wounded were moved to a central location where Eugene Rowe could care for them more efficiently, though medical supplies remained critically short. The question of cold weather gear had become somewhat academic. Most of Easy Company's soldiers now wore a patchwork combination of regular uniform, scavenged civilian clothing, and improvised insulation made from blankets and burlap sacks. They looked more like refugees than elite paratroopers, but appearances mattered less than survival. Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere, whose aggressive combat leadership had made him one of Easy Company's most respected non-commissioned officers, approached Winters that evening with a concern that transcended immediate tactical considerations. "Sir, the boys are starting to crack," Guarnere said bluntly. "Not combat-wise. They'll fight till they drop. But the cold and the hunger and not knowing if help's really coming, it's wearing them down mentally. We need something to tell them, something concrete." Winters understood the problem. Military units could endure incredible hardship if they believed it served a purpose and would eventually end. But uncertainty corroded morale more effectively than enemy fire. Men needed to know their suffering meant something, that relief was actually approaching, not just a distant possibility. "Division says Patton's within 10 miles, Winters told Guarnere. "Fighting's heavy, but he's advancing. Could be tomorrow, could be the day after, but he's coming. Tell the men that. Tell them we just have to hold one more day." Guarnere nodded slowly. "One more day. That I can sell them." "You sure about that distance estimate?" "As sure as division is," Winters replied. "Which means it's probably accurate to within 5 miles either direction. But yes, Patton's close, and he's coming hard." The night of December 21st was the coldest yet, temperature readings dropping below -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Easy Company suffered 4 more cold weather casualties during the night, men whose bodies simply could not maintain core temperature any longer. 3 were evacuated to the aid station with severe hypothermia. 1, Private Eugene O'Keefe, died in his foxhole, frozen to death while his foxhole mate slept unaware that the man beside him had stopped breathing. O'Keefe's death shocked Easy Company in a way that combat deaths had not. They were paratroopers. They accepted that men died in battle, but freezing to death while surrounded by comrades seemed somehow worse, a failure of the company to protect its own. Sergeant Carwood Lipton found O'Keefe's body during his dawn inspection of positions and immediately implemented a new procedure. Men in shared foxholes would check each other every 30 minutes throughout the night, ensuring that both remained conscious and responsive. "We've lost enough men to the cold," Lipton told his squad leaders. "We're not losing any more that way, if we can help it. Every man checks his foxhole mate every half hour. No exceptions." December 22nd dawned clear and intensely cold. The sky was a hard blue that promised no mercy and no relief from the temperature that still hovered around -20 degrees. But that clear sky brought something Easy Company desperately needed: air support. Allied fighter bombers appeared over Bastogne at mid-morning, P-47 Thunderbolts that dove on German positions with bombs and rockets, while medium bombers struck deeper targets behind German lines. Easy Company watched the airstrikes. From their positions, cheering as German positions erupted in flames and smoke, the psychological effect was enormous. For days, they had fought alone, abandoned and besieged. Now, their air force had returned, and with it came the tangible proof that the rest of the American army had not forgotten them. The clear weather also meant better supply drops. C-47 transports appeared throughout the day, flying through reduced German anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Easy Company received portions of 4 supply bundles, the most they'd gotten in a single day since the siege began. Ammunition stocks were replenished to nearly 75% of normal load. Medical supplies allowed Eugene Rowe to properly treat the wounded for the first time in days, and the food, while not lavish, was sufficient to give every man 2 adequate meals. Lieutenant Welsh distributed the supplies personally, moving from foxhole to foxhole with a detail of men carrying the precious cargo. When he reached the position held by privates Edward Heffron and William Babe Heffron, he found both men in surprisingly good spirits, despite 4 days of brutal conditions. Got ammunition, got K rations, and got something special from the chaplain, Welsh told them, pulling out a small bundle of letters that had somehow made it into one of the supply drops. Mail call, gentlemen. First mail we've had since we got here. The letters, though most were weeks old, brought a connection to a world beyond the frozen hell of Bastogne. Men read messages from home, from wives and girlfriends and parents who had no idea their loved ones were fighting for survival in Belgium. Some men cried while reading, others smiled for the first time in days. All felt the psychological boost that came from knowing they had not been entirely forgotten by the world beyond the perimeter. The improved supply situation came none too soon, because German forces launched their most determined assault yet on the afternoon of December 22nd. Having failed to break through on previous days and knowing that American relief forces were approaching, German commanders threw everything remaining at the Bastogne defenses in one last desperate attempt to capture the town. Easy Company's sector faced elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations. The attack began with the heaviest artillery barrage Easy Company had yet experienced, shells falling with such density that the earth itself seemed to shake continuously. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes, and when it lifted, German armor and infantry emerged from the tree line in overwhelming strength. Winters counted at least 5 tanks, probably Panzer IVs or Panthers, supported by what appeared to be 2 full companies of infantry. Perhaps 300 men, advancing in waves toward Easy Company's battered defenses. His own force numbered fewer than 70 effectives, and they occupied positions that had been pounded by artillery for 30 minutes. All bazooka teams to forward positions, Winters ordered over the radio. Machine guns, hold fire until they're at 200 yards. Riflemen, pick your targets and make every shot count. We stop them here, or we die here. The German tanks advanced methodically, their main guns firing at suspected American positions, while their machine guns sprayed the defensive line with suppressive fire. Behind them, German infantry moved in rushes, using the armor as mobile cover while working their way closer to Easy Company's foxholes. Joe Toy's bazooka team engaged the lead tank at 150 yards, the rocket striking the Panzer's front glacis and failing to penetrate. The tank's turret traversed toward Toy's position, and Winters watched in horror as the 75mm gun fired. The high-explosive shell detonated 10 feet from Toy's foxhole, the blast throwing Toy and Penkala like ragdolls. Medic Eugene Rowe was moving before the smoke cleared, sprinting across open ground under machine gun fire to reach the wounded men. Toy had lost most of his right leg to shrapnel, arterial blood pumping onto the frozen ground. Penkala had taken shrapnel in his chest and abdomen and wasn't moving. Rowe applied a tourniquet to Toy's leg, working with desperate speed while German bullets kicked up snow around him. "I need help here," Rowe shouted. "I need stretcher bearers now." Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere, manning a position 30 yards away, saw Rowe's predicament and grabbed 2 men. "Come on," he growled. "We're getting them out." The three men sprinted toward Rowe's position, reaching the medic just as another German shell detonated nearby. The blast caught Guarneri full force, severing his right leg below the knee and throwing him into the snow beside Toy. Now Rowe had three critically wounded men and no way to move them under the continuing German assault. The situation had spiraled into nightmare. Winters, seeing his company's forward defences collapsing and his men being cut to pieces, made the decision that would define his command that day. "Second platoon, counterattack," Winters ordered. "Drive them back before they overrun the aid station." Lieutenant Harry Welsh led the counterattack with approximately 20 men, all that remained of 2nd Platoon. They charged directly into the German advance, firing as they ran, using speed and aggression to compensate for their lack of numbers. The shock of the counterattack disrupted the German formation, causing the infantry to falter and seek cover, while 2nd Platoon held the Germans. Winters organized evacuation of the wounded. Sergeant Carwood Lipton led a team that pulled Toy, Guarneri, and Penkala back to the aid station under continuing fire. Penkala died before they reached safety, his wounds too severe for even immediate treatment to save him. But Toy and Guarneri, though grievously wounded, were still breathing when they reached Eugene Rowe's care. The German attack continued for another hour. Waves of infantry trying repeatedly to break through Easy Company's line. Each time, they were driven back, but each repulse cost Easy Company casualties they could barely afford. By the time German forces finally withdrew at dusk, Easy Company's effective strength had been reduced to fewer than 50 men capable of holding weapons and fighting. Winters gathered his remaining platoon leaders in the command post as darkness fell. Harry Welsh was there, his uniform torn by shrapnel and his face blackened by powder smoke. Carwood Lipton arrived, covered in blood from carrying wounded men, none of it his own. Buck Compton, who had been holding the company's right flank, looked shell-shocked by the day's carnage. "Status?" Winters asked simply. "2nd Platoon's down to 12 effectives," Welsh reported. "Maybe 10 if you count the walking wounded who probably shouldn't be fighting." 3rd Platoon has 14, Lipton added, but 3 of those are concussion cases who might not be functional tomorrow. Compton's report was even grimmer. "I've got 11 men left, Dick. 11 out of a platoon that was 35 strong 4 days ago. We're done. We can't hold another attack like today's." Winters understood the despair in Compton's voice. Easy Company had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. They had held for 6 days against overwhelming odds, in weather that was literally killing them, with inadequate supplies and no hope of reinforcement. They had done everything asked of them and more, but if the Germans came again tomorrow with the same strength they'd shown today, Easy Company would be overrun. There simply weren't enough men left to stop them. "Division says Patton's less than 5 miles out," Winters told his officers. "He's fighting hard, taking casualties, but he's coming. We just have to hold one more day, and we're relieved." "And if the Germans come before Patton does?" Compton asked. Winters met his gaze steadily. "Then we die here. But we die holding our positions, and we take as many of them with us as we can. That's all the 101st has ever asked of us, and that's what we're going to do." The night of December 22nd passed with Easy Company on alert, expecting another German attack at any moment. Men, too exhausted to feel fear anymore, simply waited in their foxholes, weapons ready, prepared to sell their lives as expensively as possible. The temperature dropped again, reaching -24 degrees, but the survivors of Easy Company barely noticed anymore. They had moved beyond cold into a state where their bodies simply functioned on autopilot, maintaining life through will rather than any physical comfort. Sergeant Don Malarkey made rounds of the positions through the night, checking on men and ensuring they stayed awake despite crushing exhaustion. He found Private David Kenyon, Webster, asleep at his post, face down in the snow at the bottom of his foxhole. Malarkey shook Webster awake, then stayed with him for 20 minutes, making sure he remained conscious. "How much longer, Malark?" Webster asked, his words slurred with fatigue. How much longer can we keep this up? As long as we have to, Malarkey replied, the answer he'd been giving for 6 days now. But privately, he wondered the same thing. Every man had a breaking point. Easy Company was approaching theirs. Dawn on December 23rd brought a sound that would live in the memory of every Easy Company survivor for the rest of their lives. The distant rumble of heavy artillery, but artillery firing from the south, from beyond the German lines surrounding Bastogne. Patton's Third Army had arrived, and they were smashing through German defensive positions with the overwhelming firepower that characterized American combined arms doctrine. Throughout the morning, the sounds of battle to the south grew steadily closer. German units around Bastogne began withdrawing forces from the perimeter, rushing them south to try to stop Patton's advance. The pressure on Easy Company's sector diminished noticeably, German attacks becoming half-hearted probes rather than determined assaults. At 1300 hours, radio operators picked up transmissions between American armor units and the Bastogne garrison. Patton's 4th Armored Division had broken through German lines and was approaching the town from the southwest. Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was less than 2 miles from Bastogne's perimeter. Winters gathered Easy Company together, or what remained of it, in the ruins of a farmhouse that had served as their command post for 6 days. Fewer than 50 men assembled, their faces gaunt, their uniforms more rags than clothing, their eyes holding the exhausted stare of soldiers who had endured too much for too long. "Patton's here," Winters told them simply. "Combat Command B will link up with our lines within the hour. The siege is over. You men held, against everything the Germans threw at you, against weather that should have killed you. With no winter gear and minimal supplies, you held. Every one of you is a credit to the 101st, and I'm honored to have commanded you." The men received the news in silence. They were too exhausted for celebration, too numb to feel relief. They had simply endured, and now endurance was no longer necessary. Some men wept quietly, others sat staring at nothing. A few smiled with grim satisfaction. At 1645 hours on December 23rd, 1944, the lead tanks of Combat Command B rolled into Bastogne's perimeter. The siege that had begun 6 days earlier was officially broken. Easy Company, which had entered the encirclement with over 120 men, emerged with fewer than 50 still fit for duty. They had suffered 35% casualties, most from cold weather rather than combat, and had expended virtually all their ammunition and supplies. But they had held. When German forces demanded surrender, when weather tried to kill them, when supply lines were severed and hope seemed lost, Easy Company had maintained their positions and refused to yield. They were paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, and they had proven that elite status was earned through the ability to endure beyond all reasonable limits. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hitler's last great offensive in the West had broken against the stubborn defense of Bastogne, and among the defenders who made that victory possible, Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had written one of the most remarkable chapters in American military history. They had been surrounded, outnumbered, frozen and starving. The Germans had laughed at them, these American paratroopers trapped without winter gear in minus 20-degree weather. But Easy Company had the last laugh. They held against everything, against all odds. They held their ground until Patton's tanks came through the snow. And in holding, they helped ensure that Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes ended in catastrophic defeat, hastening the end of the Third Reich and the liberation of Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.